everyone, I'm Stephanie Panay, and in today's podcast, we're going to be discussing defences. A Course in Miracles says the following: defences are the costliest of all the prices which the ego would extract. That's from lesson 153. I think it's true to say that we don't often realise when we are engaged in being defensive. We can feel agitated and feel that we have to justify ourselves when someone, say, for example, accuses us of something. Well, that's an easy, obvious form of defensiveness. But there are many other ways in which we can defend ourselves from shame and guilt. But we might not be aware that that is what we're doing. And that is what this podcast is about. I'll be reading from an essay I wrote called Seeing the Problem as It Is, Karen Horney's Defensive Solutions. As we'll see, Karen Horney was a psychoanalyst who came up with a set of character types. They seem like character types. They're defensive patterns that are so deeply embedded in us and that we act them out so naturally or so easily, but really so compulsively, that we believe that that is just who we are, and we believe that others that's just who they are. But really, it's not their personality, it's their particular pattern of defense. So that's what we'll be looking at today. I'll be reading most of the essay and I'll be following it with a discussion of some of the thoughts of Carl Jung. About 3 weeks before he died, he was having discussions with Anelia Jaff, who took down notes from these discussions, and they formed the basis of Jung's Memories, Dreams and Reflections, which is his autobiography. Well, recently a book was published called Reflections on the Life and Dreams of C.G. Jung, and that includes notes that weren't put into Memories, Dreams and Reflections. So there were some notes, the last Anelia jotted down from discussions with Jung 3 weeks before he died, which when I read them recently, I had to sit and really contemplate what exactly he was meaning. And after a series of serendipitous events, or Jung would call it synchronicity, I came to at least feel that I understood what he was saying, and I felt that it really related well to this discussion of defences. So I'm going to end with a look at those thoughts of Jung's and what I gained from them. But first, I'll read out the essay, Seeing the Problem as It Is. Half the battle in applying the principles of A Course in Miracles is being aware of when we've chosen to listen to the ego. The Course tells us that we know we're not listening to the Holy Spirit if peace isn't in our awareness. But we also know through experience that a detour away from peace can begin very subtly, as the Course warns, quote, "Take not one step into the descent to hell, for having taken one, you will not recognise the rest for what they are, and they will follow." End of quote. Sometimes choosing the ego feels good. Other times it feels bad. As Workbook Lesson 20 states, we can't tell the difference between pleasure and pain. Quote, "You want salvation, you want to be happy, you want peace. You do not have them now because your mind is totally undisciplined, and you cannot distinguish between joy and sorrow, pleasure and pain, love and fear." End of quote. Learning how to tell pleasure and pain apart is what the Course's curriculum is for. The pleasure of conquest, for example, isn't the positive thing it appears to be. To value conquest is to value the valueless, that's what the Course would say, leading to depression and despair because we've valued something that can't be shared. In this schema, we are a winner, someone else a loser. And this means we've cut our awareness off from the abundance and wholeness of our true self. If we have chosen to identify with the ego, therefore, we might feel good, but on some level we'll experience anxiety from dissociating an awareness of our source. So we might feel good from identifying with the ego and its idea of triumph, of conquest, of getting something that we were in some kind of contest with somebody else over. Well, we might feel good right then in the moment, but then the guilt will have its day, and the depression from feeling separate from our source will also have its day. Carrying on. The Course describes how psychological projection is a defence to such anxiety, which stems from guilt over our choice to turn our back on God. Feeling guilty, we try and decrease our fear of God's punishment by projecting the guilt outwards onto other people. If we feel angry towards someone, then that's a sure sign that we have chosen to identify with the ego. Indeed, the whole world, according to the Course's metaphysical underpinnings, serves as one big defence for our guilt over separating from God. It's a place in which we seem to be victimised by everyone and everything on a daily basis, and have ample cause to perceive the evildoer out there. Familiarising ourselves with defences to anxiety is therefore an important way of knowing when we've chosen to identify with the ego. Projection isn't the only defence. There are plenty more. Now we come to a subtitle called The Defence Department. Sigmund Freud was the first in his scientific field to recognise the importance of anxiety in understanding psychological disorders generally. Freud had been investigating hysterical neurosis, which was the term for someone suffering from physical symptoms without any discernible physical cause. Under hypnosis, he found that their ailments mysteriously disappeared. A person who lost their voice could talk. Someone who couldn't raise their arm could now move it effortlessly. I'll skip on a bit. For Freud, anxiety comes about through dynamic inner conflict, from having to repress something central to your being. And for Freud, these main things were aggression and sexuality, or sexual impulses, aggressive impulses. But really, if you just think of aggression and sex, you pretty much have the sum and substance of Freud's instinctual theory, and the idea that we just have those feelings. We have aggression, we have sexual feelings, and we are like, he believed his system was kind of like hydraulics. We build up a certain amount of pressure in our system from these instinctual urges that just need to be expressed. But society doesn't let them be expressed whenever we want. And so that suppression that we do, that creates anxiety. Well, in the system, it's kind of like a pressure valve that needs to be released. This is all in his system. And so until it is released, we feel anxiety. When it is released, we feel pleasure. But while we're feeling the anxiety and we feel a need to let it out, but we can't in the way we want to, we will employ certain defences. Now, the defences that Freud came up with were things like projection, and I'm going to read out a few others. So repression, for example, when a feeling, memory or perception is forced from consciousness to the unconscious, wherein it is seen as socially unacceptable. So we'll just repress that desire, that feeling, that memory, and try and act as if it's not there. That's one way to try and deal with the anxiety of this instinctual force building up. Displacement, when we direct strong emotions and frustrations toward a person or object that doesn't feel threatening. So, for example, instead of yelling at my boss, I yell at a politician on the television. And in Freud's system, we've displaced that energy, that aggressive energy that just needs to get out. We can't do it to our boss, so I'll do it to the politician on the television. Projection. When we feel guilty about an emotion or a judgment or the feeling, we're like, oh, I can't let it out. So we project that feeling onto someone else. For example, if I hate my boss but feel guilty about it, or that I can't let out that feeling, I can project my hatred onto them, perceiving them as the one who hates me. Reaction formation. When we act the opposite way to how we feel because the original sensation causes anxiety. For example, I may feel I hate my boss, but I act as if I adore him or her. Sublimation. Instead of acting on my anger, I channel it into something that vents my energy in a non-harmful way, such as playing sport. Denial, the last of the defences I'm going to talk about, when we simply refuse to accept reality or facts. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not angry at my boss. Freud's concept of anxiety is rooted in the idea of instincts and what happens if the energy associated with their expression is blocked. According to Freud, the energy builds up and produces tension, leading to nervous excitation or anxiety. Pleasure is what we experience when this tension is released. In this theory, relationships are only relevant in how they mould the expression of instinctual energy, how they affect the overall hydraulics of the individual system. Freud's is a mechanistic, biological view that neglects the powerful role of relationships in creating aggression, for example, not merely channeling it. And this is where we come to Karen Horney, who was part of what's called the cultural school of psychoanalysis that developed after Freud. She was of the opinion, as were several others, that we don't just have an instinct for aggression. It's not just something that's in our system and we've got to get it out, and then relationships just become the container for us to get the aggression out onto. She was like, no, that's like putting the cart before the horse. What comes first is the relationship, is something in the relationship that triggers aggression. The aggression isn't there looking for something to put it on. It's the relationship causes the aggression. The relationship causes the anxiety. And in this respect, I think Karen Horney and the cultural school of psychoanalysis can be expressing something a bit closer to A Course in Miracles as well than Freud, in that what she's saying is that it was some conflict in a relationship that first generated the anxiety, the guilt, the anger. And if we look at the Course's metaphysics, we see the same thing. We weren't existing in oneness. There wasn't this oneness, and all of a sudden there was aggression, and all of a sudden there was anxiety. No. In the Course's myth, what happened was there was a wish to be separate. It's all about a relationship splitting and the consequences of the believing that we had offended God. Then came the anxiety. Then came all the emotions associated with a belief in separation. So again, all this talk about Freud and A Course in Miracles. Well, how about Karen Horney? How about Jung? Freud certainly did a huge contribution in terms of showing how much internal conflict, unconscious internal conflict, affects our daily living and how we're living with it all the time. You know, whether we're showing we're diagnosed as having a particular mental disorder or not, we are all, in Freud's theory, conflicted on the inside. And that was a huge, huge goal, as in a winning goal kick from Freud. That was huge and important. And a very important starting point. But others did follow through with some very important points which we can relate to A Course in Miracles. So now a bit more about Karen Horney. Karen Horney was a German psychoanalyst who practiced in the United States later in her career and founded the American Journal of Psychoanalysis, serving as its editor until her death in 1952. She proposed a model in which an adverse family environment, for example, a home with disturbed interpersonal relationships, causes basic anxiety, which is her term for anxiety based on feeling alone and helpless in a hostile world. The basic need underlying basic anxiety, according to Horney, isn't for some kind of instinctual expression of aggressive or sexual energy, but for security. And it leads children to develop self-defeating strategies of defense. Horney suggests that what Freud calls instinctual drives are themselves a product of anxiety. So drives such as aggression aren't just there, they're a product of anxiety. Freud's concept of drive implies a compulsion from within that just happens out of nowhere. We're just built with this drive for aggression. But according to Horney, drives are impulses and needs that stem from anxiety. We can certainly become self-destructive or violent towards others in Horney's system, but this doesn't just happen or emerge from a wish to return to an inorganic state. So that bit about an inorganic state, Freud had this idea that one of the drives in us was the death drive, which is his drive to return to an inorganic state, which means just dead. That there's a drive in us to be destructive, aggressive, and to be that way towards ourselves, but then to project that out and be that way towards others. Any compulsion or strident, demanding need, says Horney, comes from an interpersonal issue that has caused anxiety. The environmental factors that matter the most in the generation of basic anxiety are conditions in the family that make a child feel unsafe, unloved, and unvalued. And as we'll see shortly, Horney's theory of defences stems from her own experience in a volatile household and with a favoured sibling. So now I'm going to read about Karen Horney's upbringing, and it gives a really good flavour for how she developed her theory of defensive systems, or what she called solutions to anxiety. Here's the subtitle, Just a Girl, Horney's Early Years. Karen Danielson was born in Hamburg in 1885. Her father, Bernd, otherwise known as Wackles, was a sea captain, and her mother, Clothild, otherwise known as Sonny, was the daughter of a successful architect. Wackles was 44 and a widower with 4 nearly grown children when he married Sonny, who was then 28. Karen was the second of 2 children born to the couple, the first being her brother Bernd, born 4 years before her. The marriage wasn't a happy one. Wackles spent a lot of time at sea, and the relative peace of the household was always disturbed when he returned home. Wackles had a temper, and Karen and her brother always sided with Sonny against what they called the Bible thrower, their nickname given to Wackles for his tendency to literally throw the Bible around. Sonny was the long-suffering wife, pleasant and popular amongst the locals. Karen's teenage diaries give a clear picture of both her sympathies and animosities at the time. Quote, I'm often quite sad and discouraged, for things are bad at home, and Sonny, my all, is so ill and unhappy. Oh, how I would love to help her and cheer her up. It must be grand to have a father one can love and esteem, and when the 4th commandment does not confront one like a terrifying spectre with its thou shalt, I think it's thou shalt love thy parents or honour thy father and thy mother. I can't do it. I can't respect that man who makes us all unhappy with his dreadful hypocrisy, selfishness, crudeness, and ill-breeding. Teenage Karen certainly gives her father a hard review, yet other reports suggest that Karen had great admiration for her father when she was a child and talked about him with awe. Even more the painful then, when Wackles refused to let Karen attend studies at university. Sonny, aware of her daughter's intellectual ability as a potential source of family pride, intervened by putting in a good word for Karen with her father. For a time, Karen was left waiting in limbo, not knowing whether she would be granted her wish. It's from her diary. This uncertainty makes me sick. Why can't father make up his mind a little faster? He who has flung out thousands for my stepbrother Enoch, who is both stupid and bad, First turns every additional penny he is to spend for me 10 times in his fingers. And we did make it clear to him that he only has to feed me as long as I attend school. Once I have my diploma, I most certainly don't want another penny from him. He would like me to stay at home now so we could dismiss our maid and I could do her work. He brings me almost to the point of cursing my good gifts. Karen felt that both her parents favoured her brother, Bernd, for whom there had been no question about attending university. In all sorts of ways, Karen noticed her brother being treated differently to her, and she felt the injustice of it. Yet she didn't want to be an outsider in the home, so she developed admiration for her mother and brother and tried to please them to gain their acceptance. Despite her best efforts, however, Karen always felt left out of the brother-mother alliance. She noted in her diary, for example, that while her mother would simply let go of any harsh word from Bernd, she'd respond to the same from Karen with reproach. Wackles was eventually persuaded by Sonny to let Karen attend university, and a short time later, when Karen was 19, Sonny and Wackles separated. There's no evidence of any further contact between Karen and her father. Karen felt abandoned by him, and at some stage, though the cause is unclear, she also felt rejected by her brother. Bernd made a point of not having much to do with her. All of this sets the scene for a defensive system that Karen took on to satisfy her needs for security. Firstly, Sonny's hatred and open contempt for Wackles made Karen assume that aligning herself with Sonny would place her on the superior side. Karen modelled herself on her mother, repressed her resentment towards her and her brother, and instead directed it all towards her father. She wanted to please Sonny and Bernd so she wouldn't be alone. She also developed what was to become a lifelong preoccupation, a fantasy of meeting a great man with whom she could merge, who would take care of her. With her father's absence, her brother's rejection, and her suspicions of being second best, Karen questioned whether she had really been wanted. The preference for boys in families was both obvious and long-standing throughout society, and is why one of Horney's major works is called The Neurotic Personality of Our Time. The neurotic personality is of our time because it is influenced by the prevailing societal values, conditions, and opportunities. Having modelled herself on her mother, yet finding a sacrificial life unsatisfying, Horney noted how society equated masochistic tendencies with feminine nature and aggressive tendencies with masculine nature. Rather than see either of these qualities as innately belonging to women or men, she regarded them as part of specific neurotic defensive structures designed to protect us from basic anxiety. Horney developed a theory that she regarded as gender neutral, recognising that culture induces a greater frequency of some psychological defences and conflicts in men and others in women. These defences are the subject of Part 2, along with an explanation of them in light of A Course in Miracles. Now, Part 2 begins with an examination of what Horney means by basic anxiety and how she differentiates that from what she calls regular anxiety, the kind of anxiety you might feel if you were running late for a train or something like that. According to Horney, basic anxiety arises out of an inner conflict between dependency and hostility, between feeling dependent on our parents and experiencing anger towards them. Regular anxiety is experienced if our needs aren't met. For example, a need for food, but this can also make us hostile. So she's distinguishing between regular anxiety and the basic anxiety. So the regular anxiety is that what you feel, for example, if you don't get food when you need it, but that can also make us hostile, and that's when the basic anxiety comes in. I'll carry on. Since we depend on our parents for everything when we are children, for physical, emotional, and psychological comfort, We don't want to damage our relationship with them by venting our hostility. Yet, keeping our feelings under wraps doesn't help us a great deal. Since we depend on our parents for everything when we are children, for physical, emotional, and psychological comfort, we don't want to damage our relationship with them by venting our hostility. Yet, keeping our feelings under wraps doesn't help us a great deal because the hostility will remain and make us feel guilty and fearful of reprisal. This, in turn, leads to basic anxiety along with feelings of weakness. Horney points out that it's not deprivation or punishment per se that is the problem in basic anxiety, but the spirit in which it occurs. If a child feels rejected, unwanted, unsafe, confused by mixed messages, or displaced by another child, their anxiety can lead to the development of neurotic defences. So what she's saying there is that just saying no to a child when they want more biscuits or something like that doesn't necessarily lead to basic anxiety, to the child feeling unsafe in the world because you're being hostile. If you're not being hostile, if you haven't got that intent when you're saying, no, you can't have that, there's some sense of the child knows that you are still there for them, it's not overly punitive. They're not going to suffer any basic anxiety. And it's, sending a child to the naughty corner isn't necessarily going to lead to basic anxiety in the child. So in the course's terminology, we'd say it's not the form, it's the content that Karen Horney is talking about. It is whether we are doing it with aggression or whether we're doing it just out of kindness, out of just what you do. You discipline your child so that they learn to be able to contain themselves and they don't hurt themselves. Carrying on. Neurotic defences can form a pattern, a particular structure resembling a personality, and this functions as a form of armour. We adopt it to keep us safe, but it also alienates us from our true self. Therefore, we can't help but still feel lonely on some level for the self we've left behind. We limit our self-expression, spontaneity, and preferences in order to adjust to our chosen armour. So here we're talking about authenticity, so not being your authentic self. And that relates to your personality, and that relates to your true character, as well as to your truest self in terms of your spiritual self. So if we didn't have shame or guilt associated with our personality and expressing our personality, our innate self, then we'd feel the wholeness of ourself, of our personality, and we'd feel the wholeness of our spiritual self, because the spiritual self has no shame or guilt. Okay, so now we're going to discuss what those different patterns of defense are. Subtitle: Horney's Defensive Solutions. Horney identified 3 major patterns of neurotic defences to basic anxiety, and she called these patterns solutions. And they are the compliant solution, the aggressive solution, and the detached solution. Each represents a movement towards or against or away from others, respectively. So the compliant person moves towards others in an attempt to cling to the most powerful person around them, who they feel dependent on for their security. They protect themselves from a fear of retribution by becoming submissive and not upsetting people. And they have an idealised view of love in which a perfect match would solve all their problems and provide them with ultimate fulfilment. They fear expressing personal power in the world and challenging authority. They are self-effacing, self-sacrificial, and prone to stretch themselves too thin in their desire to please and help others. Their driving need is for affection and to be thought of as a good person. They have what's commonly called these days a disease to please. The aggressive person moves against others by rebelling and fighting. They react against their own feelings of helplessness and inferiority by striving for power and control over others. They like people to be envious of them. They're happy to exploit others to get to the top, and they generally have what we'd now call a narcissistic personality. And no matter how strong the cliche, I still come across people with this solution, citing "My Way" as their favourite song. You know, that Frank Sinatra, "I did it my way." While the compliant type is afraid of upsetting or displeasing people, the aggressive type is afraid of feeling insignificant. Horney also describes 3 subsets of the aggressive type, a full description of which can be found in my book Above the Battleground, The Courageous Path to Emotional Autonomy and Inner Peace. And in that book, you'll find a much greater detail, and you'll find charts summarising these defensive solutions if you're interested. Horney identifies the craving for affection within the compliant solution and the craving for power and control within the aggressive solution as the 2 main driving forces in the adoption of neurotic defences. The compliant type needs to feel they are a good person, and the aggressive type needs to feel they are significant. In terms of A Course in Miracles, we can see these 2 solutions as reflecting the 2 main ways we can respond to the perceived split from God. The compliant type is fearful of God's retaliation for moving independently, a challenge to his authority. The aggressive type feels abandoned, rejected by God, which is a projection of their own act of turning their back on God's love, saying it wasn't enough, and they fear being regarded as inferior or insignificant. This is a quote from the Course. All who believe in separation have a basic fear of retaliation and abandonment. They believe in attack and rejection, so that is what they perceive and teach and learn. So Horney's basic anxiety, we can fit this into this Course quote here, all who believe in separation have a basic anxiety of retaliation and abandonment. They believe in attack and rejection, so that is what they perceive and teach and learn. Okay. In line with the work of psychoanalyst Helen Block Lewis on shame and guilt proneness, which I talk a lot about in Above the Battleground, we can equate the compliant type with guilt proneness and the aggressive type with shame proneness. And of course, societal expectations and conditioning surrounding gender means that each of these types tends to be exhibited more or less along those lines. The guilt-prone person is concerned with doing the right thing, the shame-prone person with doing something impressive, good or bad. Whether you adopt the compliant or the aggressive solution, you will still feel a great deal of ups and downs according to how your defensive needs are met. Both solutions rely heavily on your interactions with others. Horney's 3rd solution is an attempt to avoid this emotional turmoil and is called the detached solution. The detached person moves away from others by trying to shut them out of their inner life, withdrawing from them emotionally. The main desire of the detached person is not to be bothered by anyone. They don't want to feel tied down by others or restricted in any way. Getting to know people can lead to expectations and demands. Better to stay detached and be free, cruising through life on an even keel. Having adopted a solution to defend us from basic anxiety, believing that this behavioural pattern will keep us safe, we're now faced with another problem. Any threat to this pattern that we've adopted becomes anxiety-producing itself. If a situation arises that requires us to act in a way that challenges our usual mode of relating to others, we feel threatened. For example, the compliant and dependent type might fear that if they are assertive, their partner will leave them or retaliate in some other way, get angry or something. Or if a person's safety depends on being, or their sense of safety depends on being unobtrusive anxiety will emerge when they are thrust into the limelight. In contrast, the aggressive type, whose basic anxiety as a child could be allayed by admiration and being noticed, they will experience anxiety at the prospect of being unrecognised and unadmired. Horney believed that a great deal of therapeutic effect lies in simply becoming aware of your defensive patterns. We can become aware of the past shaping of our attitude, but there's real benefit in being able to place that attitude within a larger constellation of defences and seeing the logic behind the whole. By understanding the function of an attitude, such as I have to please or being noticed is important to me, we are better able to distance ourselves from it, taking on the position of an observer. For example, we can say how our need for affection clashes with someone's need to dominate and control, and why we truly hate each other in those moments. In coarse terms, we can see how our special love bargains, in which we'll scratch someone's solution if they'll scratch ours, turn into opportunities for hostility when we don't get our security needs met. Okay, carrying on. Defences, a double-edged sword. Apart from adopting her mother's compliance solution to a large degree, Karen Horney also recognised she had a need to become something special, and that this stemmed from inferiority feelings, most likely in relation to the status of her brother within the family and to her feelings of abandonment. Academic achievement was a way of compensating for this sense of inferiority and fear of further abandonment. However, her strong sense of ambition went against the grain of her compliant solution, which demanded that she be self-effacing, modest, and concerned with pleasing others. This caused so much inner conflict that Horney experienced a recurring, paralysing fatigue that inhibited her ability to work. What happened whenever she'd come up with a good idea and start writing about it, all of a sudden there was this prohibition, to being expressing herself in the world, to being known, to being, self-expression is a very positive, self-affirming thing to do. And if you're adopted a compliant defensive solution, self-expression is a no-no. You're supposed to let other people do the expressing, and you're the supportive person who does the caring. So she'd come across that defensiveness, that anxiety over that self-expression, because that was going against the grain of her compliant solution. That anxiety caused the fatigue. Okay, that's the thing with adopting a defensive solution. The tendencies of the opposite solution remain within us. And the tension between them means that we can never really proceed with anything in a wholehearted way. Readers familiar with Carl Jung's work will see the similarity between Horney's conflicting solutions and Jung's theory on reconciling opposites. What Jung regards as projections of the anima and animus, the disowned feminine and masculine within, shares a lot in common with Horney's compliant and aggressive types respectively. The solution we abhor in another, for example, aggressive dominance and selfishness, or fastidiousness and fussing over others, shows us what we have disowned within ourselves. The task is to forgive ourselves for those very qualities and in the process allow the positive equivalents, for example, self-expression and self-care, as opposed to aggressive dominance and selfishness, and thoroughness and being considerate would be the positive aspect or replacement for fastidiousness and fussing. The task is to forgive ourselves for those very qualities and in the process allow these positive equivalents to come through. We can also view the aggressive and compliant solutions with regard to the course's use of leader and follower, respectively. This is a quote from the course. The leader and the follower emerge as separate roles, each seeming to possess advantages you would not want to lose. So in their fusion, there appears to be the hope of satisfaction and of peace. You see yourself divided into both these roles, forever split between the two. Perhaps you call it love. Perhaps you think that it is murder, justified at last. You hate the one you gave the leader's role when you would have it, and you hate as well his not assuming it at times you want to let the follower in you arise and give away the role of leadership. End of quote. Leader and follower, hammer and anvil, victimizer and victim. Whichever we choose to identify with, will experience loss because we've identified with differences and therefore with separation. Healing occurs when we choose to walk beside someone in acknowledgement of our common need to know of our holy self. Becoming aware of our defences is an important first step in getting to know when we've chosen the ego. Without the Holy Spirit's help, however, the task of letting them go is too great because we're so identified with the world's dream and with the body. Our sense of insecurity can only be surmounted by exchanging our perspective for a view from above the battleground, where we know of the wholeness and invulnerability of our spiritual self. The solutions don't succeed in defending us from a fear of punishment and from a fear of abandonment. This is because our fear of retaliation and abandonment ultimately stems from our belief that we have separated from God, and also our sense of incompletion stems from that as well. The Course also points out that running to our defences actually increases our anxiety, because having a defence says to yourself that you have something in need of defence. It's like the defense is a witness to your vulnerability. So that just increases your anxiety. This is a quote from the Course. Yet is defensiveness a double threat, for it attests to weakness and sets up a system of defense that cannot work. By going straight to our defensive solutions when we perceive a threat, we are reinforcing our vulnerability instead of diminishing it. Not only do we perceive a threat outside of us, but we feel a threat inside in the form of an inherent weakness. This sets up a vicious cycle in which seeking affirmations from outside ourselves makes us feel weaker inside, which in turn makes us feel the need for more external affirmation, and on it goes. The very existence of a defense says that we have chosen to believe that we have separated from God, which is why they are the costliest of all the prices which the ego would exact. So that's the quote that we started with at the beginning. Defences are the costliest of all the prices which the ego would exact. This vicious cycle ramps up the intensity of our demands on someone or something outside ourselves to alleviate our anxiety. And of course, nothing is quite so off-putting than someone else's neediness. This is particularly so for the aggressive and detached solutions. All the more important then for a compliant type to remember to ask for help from the Holy Spirit, to look at what is going on when they feel anxious and in need of external affirmations to feel safe. So too for the aggressive type who finds themselves feeling a lack of power or control, and for the detached type who is forced through circumstance to develop a direct degree of intimacy with others, such as during a time of illness. In every situation in which we feel unsure of our worth and our security, we can remember to choose between the weakness of our ego and its defences and the strength of our one self, the strength of Christ in us. Quote from the Course, "Defencelessness is strength. It testifies to recognition of the Christ in you. Perhaps you will recall the text maintains that choice is always made between Christ's strength and your own weakness, seen apart from him." End of quote. We are not alone and helpless in a hostile world. At least we don't have to perceive things this way, and we won't perceive them this way if we remember who walks with us and that our safety lies in the truth of our wholeness and holiness. In the Course's workbook lessons 37, My Holiness Blesses the World, we are told that our purpose and true function is to see the world through our own holiness. If we look through the eyes of our ego, and thus with our defensive system, we will feel we need something from someone else in order to feel good, powerful, free, or secure. In contrast, Those who see themselves as whole make no demands, the Course tells us. This refers to content and not form. Our requests needn't come from emotional neediness. A sense of peace and contentment follows our decision to identify with our holiness and strength. It is a feeling of self-respect and wholeness in recognition of our shared self. We belong to ourselves rather than to our ego and the tyranny of our defensive solutions, shoulds and musts, and can rest inwardly no matter what we are doing. You could say that an aim of the Course is to help us carry this sense of rest with us in recognition that there's nothing we need do for our salvation because our self, capital S self, is just perfect, right here, right now, as it is. End the essay with this quote from the Course. Your holiness is the answer to every question that was ever asked, is being asked now, or will be asked in the future. Your holiness means the end of guilt, and therefore the end of hell. Okay, so now I'd like to weave into all of this discussion of defences and Karen Horney's solutions the last notes that Anelia Jaff made of Jung's discussions with her. And so 3 weeks before Jung's death, this is what he said. Nothing can be created without indebtedness, and only one who bears the cost can create. The person without indebtedness who renounces the world and refuses to pay life's dues does not achieve individuation, because the dark God would find no place in him. So when I read this, I had to think a lot about what exactly is Jung meaning by indebtedness? What is he meaning by paying life's dues? And what is he meaning by bearing the cost to create? I feel that what he is saying is that when we no longer listen to the ego, and in his terms it would be listening to our capital S spiritual self, we'd say listening to the Holy Spirit, we then we're indebted to them because we need them. When we decide to go forward with forgiveness and practicing forgiveness, becoming more of who we are as a spiritual self, which also means more of who we are in terms of our authentic personality, we need the Holy Spirit's help. We need to be in tune with that transcendent source of truth to move forward. And I believe that's what Jung means by that indebtedness. And the cost, only the one who bears the cost can create. What he means there is the cost of creation, being able to create. Create means something new. So that means going forward. The cost that you bear to be able to go forward is the end of the old. It's what Jung would call the sacrifice of the old. Letting go of the old, letting go of the old ways. And that can feel like sacrifice because we are resistant to moving forward. There's always a fear of letting go of the past, of letting go of the devil we know. And so it is experienced as pain. The Course says the process can be painful, though it needn't be, but generally it is, because we are so identified with the ego that when we are letting go of aspects of our identification with it based on shame and guilt, we'll experience a kind of sense of loss, and there will be pain due to our resistance to let it go. So that, I believe, is what Jung means by that sentence. Nothing can be created without indebtedness, and only one who bears the cost can create, can move forward, can embody who they are and embody their holiness and wholeness. That next part where it says the person without indebtedness, so the person who doesn't make themselves available to the inspiration and the guidance of the Holy Spirit, the person who renounces the world and refuses to pay life's dues, does not achieve individuation. So individuation in Jung's psychology is becoming who you are, without the shoulds, the oughts of society, of shame and guilt. So becoming who you were meant to be. And that will always be an experience of wholeness. So the person who doesn't make themselves available to that inspiration, who renounces the world and refuses to pay life's dues. So life's dues are those costs, are the things that challenge us to move forward and to embody more of who we are, that come our way. And that's what he means by because the dark God would find no place in them. For Jung, the dark God is that which comes your way to move you forward or that which inspires things to move you forward, but they're often experienced as difficult challenges. And that's why he refers to it as the dark God. It's what comes in your path that, challenges you to let go of the past, to look at your shadow, to see where you want to go, and to let go of the hindrances to moving in that direction. Now, all of this is explained very well in the beginning of this book called Reflections on the Life and Dreams of C.G. Jung, in a section where it's called Accepting What Life Presents Me With. And this is what Jung had to say about 3 years before what I've just read. People do not realise just how much they are putting at risk when they don't accept what life presents them with, the questions and tasks that life sets them. Or you could say that the dark God sets them, just a terminology of Jung's. When they resolve to spare themselves the pain and suffering they owe to their nature, the pain and suffering they owe to their nature, meaning that to embody their nature, there will be experience of some suffering and pain as we let go of the past and step into aspects of ourselves that we have in the past been scared to step into. Okay. In so doing, they refuse to pay life's dues. And for this very reason, life then often leads them astray. If we don't accept our own destiny, a different kind of suffering takes its place. A neurosis develops. And I believe that that life which we have to live is not as bad as a neurosis. If I have to suffer, then let it be from my reality. A neurosis is a much greater curse. In general, a neurosis is a replacement for an evasion, an unconscious desire to cheat life, to avoid something. Now, I'd like to describe for you something that will help give this idea of a neurosis being an evasion, of trying to cheat life or really trying to not go forward, which means not deal with the ego and the shame and guilt and the past associated with it. So the other day, I was walking in my neighbourhood and I came to my street and I could see 2 young girls with a black Labrador who looked to be not much older than, say, 8 months. Beautiful, beautiful little dog. But they were trying to cross the road with it and it was just pulling on the leash. It was too scared. It was stopping and yet there were no cars around. It was peaceful. And I was just so drawn to this little dog and I just patted it and I said, have courage. You can cross the road. It's okay. And then I went on my way. I don't know if they ended up crossing the road or not, but I am a sucker for a very cute dog, or any dogs really. Anyway, that occurred to me as a really good metaphor for what I had just been reading in Jung. We come to a threshold where we need to cross to get to the other side, but we become scared, like that dog, that little young Labrador. We hunker back, but it's peaceful. There really isn't a threat, but we imagine it to be scary, that there's something scary about it. And the ego would tell us there's something scary about it for 2 reasons. It doesn't want us to let go of the past and our past grievances. So it'll say, yeah, don't look at them. They're just too scary. But also it doesn't want us to move forward because moving forward means embodying more of our spiritual self. And the ego just doesn't want us to do that. So they're faux fears. They're fears based on the past and based on a future that is not scary if we let go of the past. In fact, a scary future is only guaranteed if we hold on to the past. And it's only scary because we keep interpreting our past in scary ways and ourself in scary ways. So as we let go of our roles as a self-effacing person with a desire to please, or as we discussed in the last video, I'm not sure which video it was, but I discussed Cartman's triangle, and we may see ourselves as a rescuer or a victim or a persecutor. But as I mentioned there, persecutors and rescuers also see themselves as victims. Everybody sees themselves as everything at some stage. Rather than holding on to those roles, or a role as a masterful person or a helper, we can start to let go of them because they are all defenses to underlying anxieties based on feeling separate from God, based on feeling we're separated from God. And as we let go of that, we can step more into the roles appointed for us as we practice forgiveness, our one special function. As we practice forgiveness and let go of the past, we will step into other avenues that make use of our abilities, our experience, in a way that is truly helpful to ourselves and to other people. But in being scared of going forward, we can retreat back to those old roles of fixer, helper, carer, achiever, entertainer, whatever it is, that has provided a sense of pride in us or defended us from deep insecurities. We can go back to that, but we will project the responsibility for that out onto other people and feel that they've dragged us, their needs, their requests have dragged us back into those roles. But really, we are the ones who have felt attracted to inhabiting those roles again. And so whatever their requests are or needs have been, we have taken those roles seriously again and taken those people's requests seriously and have over-identified with those roles and will really hate it. We'll hate being in it because it's over. It is over, but we are still attracted to embodying those roles because we are scared of going forward. The way out is to not take those roles so seriously, not take those requests of others so seriously, and remember that the Holy Spirit is the one that we need to turn to answer those requests first within our minds before we go forward and do anything. But also notice how much we cling to those roles and then know the cost. And also understand that our attraction to those roles is because we are afraid of really committing to our special function of forgiveness, our only special function. And that will be reflected also in being afraid to commit to new roles that we are to inhabit in the world, in whatever way that manifests. Our abilities, our talents, our experience can now be used as a way to help ourselves and others practice forgiveness and heal. And that requires a commitment to make forgiveness the most important thing in our lives. And that is like Jung talking about our indebtedness as we move forward and the cost that we bear. But he always talks about our commitment. Jung is very big on responsibility and commitment. Commitment to the path of moving forward also means being prepared to accept the responsibilities that come with moving forward. And so sometimes we can also be afraid of the responsibilities that might come our way from moving forward. But there's a great line in the course where it says something like, I'm not sure of the exact wording, I can't remember, but once you decide to do what you cannot do alone, You are no longer alone. And the Course also says that the sole responsibility of the miracle worker is to accept the atonement for themselves. So as you remember that you have that great help with you, and that accepting the atonement is the most important thing or that you are responsible for in any given moment or day, which means remembering that helper with you and the memory that they bring of your innate holiness and wholeness, that is what will help you do whatever you need to do as part of your roles as you move forward in the world, with forgiveness being your most important goal. So in line with Jung's focus on commitment and an ability to accept responsibility for your own life, I'd like to read out a bit from lesson 154, which is called I Am Among the Ministers of God. Let us today be neither arrogant nor falsely humble. We have gone beyond such foolishness. We cannot judge ourselves, nor need we do so. These are but attempts to hold decision off and to delay commitment to our function. It is not our part to judge our worth, nor can we know what role is best for us. What we can do within a larger plan we cannot see in its entirety. Our part is cast in heaven, not in hell, and what we think is weakness can be strength. What we believe to be our strength is often arrogance. Whatever your appointed role may be, it was selected by the voice for God, whose function is to speak for you as well. Seeing your strengths exactly as they are, and equally aware of where they can be best applied, for what, to whom, and when, He chooses and accepts your part for you. He does not work without your own consent, but He is not deceived in what you are, and listens only to His voice in you. It is through His ability to hear one voice, which is His own, that you become aware at last there is one voice in you, and that one voice appoints your function and relays it to you, giving you the strength to understand it, do what it entails, and to succeed in everything you do that is related to it. God has joined His Son in this, and thus His Son becomes His messenger of unity with Him. And I'll stop reading the lesson there, but it's a wonderful lesson for encouraging us to cross the road. That little black Labrador, just imagine, cross the road and commit and accept to that function of forgiveness, and have that be and lead you to your roles, whatever role you are to fulfill in your day, rather than retreating to those defensive roles, the compliant type, the aggressive type, the detached type, or the fixer, the rescuer, the persecutor or dominant kind of overbearing person, or the person who wants a lot of control over others. When you find those things coming up, think of it, rather than be, oh no, down on yourself, think of it like, oh wow, I must be at a crossing for these things to be coming up so strongly now. And my frustration shouldn't be at the people that I blame for kind of roping me back into those roles. I need to realise that I have stepped into them willingly because I'm afraid to cross the road. But there is nothing to fear. And to take hold of Jesus' hand and step forward with a positive appreciation of where you're heading. Hopefully that helps you along the way. And thank you so much for listening. I hope this has been of help with you. And let's all step forward together and enjoy the future and the now. Thank you. Bye-bye.